have till 11:50, but say most people are not going to need it because it's just the objective part. But your essay is due on Monday. So, yeah, the same day as the exam.
What about the
Well, I told people today would be the last day, but since I wasn't here on Monday, we'll get, I'll let people turn in some on exam day, but after exam day, that's like the cutoff for everything. I don't make any guarantees that anything that's not in my hands by then will be counted. So you need to get in everything by Monday. Okay, good question. So we're looking at the British Empiricism PowerPoint. I like working in this area. I was actually, even though I didn't finish my doctorate, I was working on the Scottish reaction to British empiricism, because I don't like the skepticism that it led us to, and there are ways of replying to it. And I've been over there twice in 1995 and 1985, giving papers and commenting on them at international conferences. So, it's nice when you're working in that area and you need to go to a conference. It's in the British Isles. So we call them the British empiricists because they're from one part or another of the British Isles. John Locke was from England, although he spent a lot of his adult life on the run for political reasons. George Berkeley from Ireland, David Hume from Scotland. And of course, empiricism is the view that all knowledge must be based on experience. There are no innate ideas. We do not have innate knowledge. As John Locke puts it in this first thing, what does Locke mean by his claim that the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, a blank tablet? Well, it's like these blackboards here. The empiricist view is that we have no knowledge when we come into this world, and so we find that that means, for one thing, they can't use innate ideas like Descartes did to get them out of skepticism. And a consequence of this is that their view ultimately led to a more skeptical position. So what writes on the tablet of our minds is experience after birth, after we're born. Now, Locke's definition of idea is something that is a technical term for him. And he uses it in a broader sense than most people used it before Locke. It's the immediate object of perception. He says it's whatever the mind is acquainted with when somebody thinks or experiences. Basically, anything we experience mentally for Locke is an idea. As I tell people, it includes everything and the kitchen sink, because the kitchen sink is an idea, or at least a conglomeration of ideas for Locke as well. So you have to understand that idea is a technical term for him. Even though Hume narrowed the definition of idea, Hume still talks about perceptions as encompassing everything we're immediately acquainted with, everything, Locke says an idea is whatever the object is the object of the understanding. so it's what we are immediately acquainted with. And of course, you know, the problem with this is, if we're only acquainted with our own mental life, how do we philosophically get beyond that to saying that anything exists beyond us? You know, why don't we all be solipsists? Solipsism is the view that we can know only the contents of our own minds, and we don't know and can't prove whether or not anything besides us exists. So experience writes on the tablet, an idea is a technical term. Locke's opinion of innate ideas is that there aren't any. He spends the first one or two books, I forget, it's been a while since I actually read those, of his essay concerning human understanding, his main work on the theory of knowledge, arguing against the existence of innate ideas. So it's not just that Locke had an opinion of it, but he tried to philosophically shoot down the views of people like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, people who thought we had innate ideas. So there are some copies of this on the table there. Now, sensation and reflection basically are the two sources of experience. Sensation is experience of what is outside of us. Reflection has to do with reflecting on what goes on in our own thoughts, in our own minds. And that's a source of inner ideas. Now, ideas are ideas of the attributes or qualities of things. And depending on what they're of, if they're only an idea of a single quality of a thing, like, you know, the red color of a telephone, then they're a simple idea. But an object like a telephone, for Locke, as we first perceive it, is a complex idea that is composed or comprised of many simple ideas. And in other words, the complex idea is our experience of the telephone itself. The simple ideas that comprise it are things like the red color of the telephone, its shape, its size, its weight, that it makes a sound, that it feels hard to the touch or cool to the touch. All of these are ideas we have of the properties or qualities of the telephone. And so a complex idea then is composed of a combination of simple ideas. The complex idea of the telephone is composed of all the simple ideas we have of its properties. So our ideas are ideas of the qualities or the properties of a thing. And when I say which are really in objects for Locke and which are subjective, well, Locke divides the qualities or properties of a thing into two main classes, primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities, he thinks, are really in objects, and our experience of them resembles the quality itself. In other words, the rectangular shape of that blackboard across the way is for Locke a primary quality, and the idea I have in my mind of the rectangular shape of the blackboard resembles and represents that quality of rectangularity. The idea I have of the size of the blackboard resembles, the blackboard as it is. So things like size, shape, hardness, the ability to occupy space, that is extension in space. These, for Locke, are primary qualities that a thing has in the world. And it has these properties no matter what we think of it. In other words, for Locke, that blackboard was hanging there on the wall when you and I were not here. And it has those primary qualities. But what about the fact that if I touched the blackboard, it would feel cool to the touch, especially the metal around the edge? What about the black color? We, after all, call it a blackboard. Well, for Locke, these are secondary qualities, secondary properties. And for Locke, the black color is not in the blackboard. But it's subjective and in us. It's caused by the properties in the blackboard. Now look, Locke was an actual friend of Newton. He knows about molecules and atoms, right? He knows that molecules and atoms in something help cause experiences in us, right? And so, the motion of the minute particles of the blackboard and light bouncing off them causes us to have very subjective impressions, like an experience of the color black if I look at the blackboard, or if I were to go over there and put my hand against it, the feeling that it's cool to the touch. But things like, a good way to separate the primary from the secondary qualities is most of the secondary qualities have to do with only one sense. So there are things like smells, tastes, sounds, feelings of heat or cold, perceptions of color. These, for Locke, are subjective and in us. Now, the point is, for something to be subjective and in a perceiver, what has to exist? Well, somebody capable of having that experience. In other words, for the blackboard to exist, for Locke, it can exist as a material object, but the subjective properties of the blackboard, its color, its feeling of heat or cold, they're in us. And I showed you one of the arguments he uses arguing for the subjective nature of secondary properties, where he gives us 3 buckets of water, and he argues that warmth and cold are properties of are not properties of the water itself, but they're in us, because otherwise we'd have to conclude that the same water is both hot and cold, which is a contradiction, which can't be true. And that, of course, is in the slides. But Locke uses a number of arguments like this to try to convince us that secondary properties aren't in us. And Berkeley followed up on him. Berkeley says, consider, as cold as it is out there, you like to come in from the warmth. And if there were a fire going in the fireplace, if it came in from the cold and the wetness, it would be a pleasant experience standing and getting a little heat from the fireplace, right? Well, Berkeley says, well, isn't a lower degree of heat actually a pleasant sensation? The sensation of pleasure? But now suppose you were trying to get warm a little too quickly, and you stood too close to the fire, and you started to burn your hand or another part. Well, it would be burned because you got too close to the fire, because you experienced a more intense degree of heat. So Berkeley says, well, wait a second. Isn't an intense degree of heat, like what you'd get by standing too close to the fire, another sensation? Isn't it a pain? But then Berkeley goes on. In other words, he's agreeing with Locke here, that feelings of warmth and cold aren't in things but are subjective and in us. He says, okay, so a lower degree of heat is pleasure, a pleasurable sensation. A higher degree of heat is a pain. But now, wait a second, you wouldn't want to say pleasure and pain are in the fire as properties of the fire, right? We don't say that the fire in the fireplace feels pleasure or pain. So he says, but if a low degree of heat is pleasure and a high degree of heat is pain, and you don't want to say pleasure and pain are properties of the fire, why would you want to say warmth and cold are properties of the fire? Why would you want to say that any degree of heat is a property of the fire? Now, this is one of those arguments that David Hume, see, Berkeley says, I'm not a skeptic. I'm telling you straight off, there is no such thing as a material world. Material objects don't exist independently of perceivers. Now, Descartes and Locke both thought they did, and so does most every other person on the planet. But Berkeley says a skeptic is somebody who doubts of things, and I don't have any doubt that there's no material world. Well, but the argument I just went over about heat and cold is one of those arguments that I think David Hume talked about when David Hume said Berkeley is a skeptic. And that he is a skeptic can be seen from this, that his arguments admit of no refutation and they produce no conviction. What does he mean? That we could take an argument like the one I just gave you about, warmth and cold not being properties of the fire, and we hear it, and we may not know how to answer that reasoning, but we don't buy it. Hume says it's a characteristic of skeptical arguments that even if we don't know how to counter the argument logically, we still don't buy the conclusion. We're not ready to buy the conclusion that there's no such thing as warmth in the fire. We're not ready to buy the conclusion that blackness is not a property of the blackboard, but is just subjective and in us. And so, this is one of the things Hume was getting at. Let me go call the roll before I... For most of what there is, there are separate integrity files where I went over these PowerPoints. And of course there are 3 PowerPoints, but concentrate on the one on Descartes' Meditations and British Empiricism. The one on Hume on the Self, I would look at, but most of the questions are going to come from the first 2. That's okay. I know what that is. I'm going to let her leave a message. Yeah, I'll let her leave a message. I know what that's about. Okay. So here's Locke with the view that says what our mind is immediately acquainted with is not things in the external world, but it's immediately acquainted with its own ideas. Now, for Locke, these ideas represent things in the external world. And he is confident that in many ways they represent things accurately. In other words, my subjective ideas of the qualities of the blackboard actually relate to, you know, the fact that there is a blackboard there. It has a certain size, shape, and what have you. But this is what we mean by a representative theory of perception. The view that the immediate object that the mind is acquainted with is an internal representation of something outside itself, and that we know things through the intermediation of ideas for Locke. In other words, the mind knows ideas, and the ideas represent the external world. But the problem is that we can never get beyond the ideas on a view like Locke's to check and see whether they really do represent the external world accurately. I gave that illustration about projecting pictures of a doll on various screens, and if you could see the doll and see the screens of the TVs it was projected on, you could tell whether or not the TVs accurately represented the doll. But the problem is, on a view like Locke's, the mind is always only acquainted with its own inner ideas, its own inner representations, and it can never get behind them to check and see if they're accurate. This is why this view led to what, and I'm not going to ask you this term, but in the 20th century, some people like Richard Rorty call this kind of skepticism that Locke was on the way to. Locke was not a skeptic, but Hume ended in skepticism. But it's sometimes called veil of ideas skepticism. The idea is, what is a veil? It's something, you know, in front of us that we have to get through. Well, it's like we have to perceive the world through a veil of ideas, and the question becomes, how do we know that those ideas represent anything accurately? But also, there's a view of material substance as an I don't know what, as a substratum that underlies perceivable qualities. And Locke thinks that something like the blackboard, the table, that all of these, that material substances are capable of existing on their own, whether they're perceived or not. And we know them by inner representations. But the point is that that you can't justify anything beyond the ideas. And Berkeley saw this, and he said, a view like Locke leads to skepticism. By the way, those last things, disregard them on property rights and a defense of capitalism. I don't think I even have that on your syllabus. That's Locke's politics that we never went into, so you can scratch those out. On what did Locke base our right to property? Why is Locke's citation of property rights? Those two, just scratch it out. So George Berkeley, though, tries to convince us that everything is mental, that there is no gap between the world as we perceive it and the world as it is. We really do perceive the world as it is for Berkeley, but the world as it is entirely mental. For Berkeley, the only things that exist are minds and the sensations, or ideas and minds. So we call this view idealism, the view that everything is mental. And S for Kippy, to understand how Berkeley gets there, I'm going to sort of summarize things because we only have about 5 minutes. To understand how he gets there, remember that for Locke, a material object like a telephone is just a combination of primary and secondary properties, at least as we experience it. Well, Locke has already argued that all the secondary properties exist in our minds. They're subjective. They're caused by the primary properties, but they're not real properties in things. Well, what Berkeley does is, and the way he gets to saying everything is mental, is he says, well, you know what? I can give you similar ideas to show that even the primary properties aren't really, are subjective and mind-dependent. And I gave you that argument that he gives about size, the size of a mite's foot. A mite's foot is average size to a mite, very small to us, and huge to a germ on the mite's foot. Well, the mite's foot can't be both huge and small at the same time, so how do we get around this? We say that the mite's foot is that the size of the mite's foot is subjective and in us. Now, the point is, for Locke, size, like the size of that blackboard over there, is a primary property. In other words, I have subjective inner experiences that really represent, on Locke's view, the relative size of that blackboard. And it has only one size, and there's only one number. Things like extension in space, size, motion, those are primary properties. But Berkeley says, wait a second, size is relative to the perceiver. Back when we used to have a pro basketball team, back when I was in high school, sometimes we'd get a discounted tickets on our high school IDs down the Civic Center, but they would be way in the nosebleed section, right? Well, you know, there are tables like this that they often have on the side where you have the officials and the statisticians and stuff keeping various pieces of information and the announcers down on the court. Well, to somebody sitting at the table, it's of normal size. But if you're up there in the nosebleed section, that table looks very small. Well, Hume argued that size is relative to the perceiver on the basis of stuff like that. So for Berkeley, everything, how does it get to be as to be perceived? I just want to go over this one main point in the 2 or 3 minutes we have left. Basically, everything then that we experience is an idea, is a sensation in our minds for Berkeley. And it's either caused directly in us by God, and that's what happens with ideas that we have no control over, like the ideas of the desk and the blackboard, or they're produced in us. Now, sensations or ideas don't exist except in a mind that can have sensations and ideas, right? It makes no sense at all to say that there's a pain in this room and it's existing, but there's nobody experiencing that pain right now, and that pain will be here when we all leave the room. If I claim something like that, you'd think this guy's going off the deep end, right? Pains don't exist just in space without somebody being able to feel a pain. But Berkeley says, wait a second, all these other, what Locke calls ideas, all these other sensations of the qualities of things, like size, weight, texture, color, Berkeley says, what are they but sensations in the mind? And all sensations, whether they're sensations of color or an inner sensation like a sensation of pain, they all need a perceiver to exist. They need a mind that can experience a sensation. So if what we call a material thing is just a complex of sensations, it cannot exist except in a mind, our mind or God's mind. So hence Berkeley, esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. To exist, if everything is mental, is to exist as an experience of some mind or other, either my mind or God's mind or both. You know? So that's how he gets to his main theory, that to exist, to be is to be perceived. So the word sensations have to exist in a mind, a being capable of having sensations. So we say that they are dependent on a mind for their existence, that they're mind dependent. Well, if all the qualities of a thing, like a telephone, are sensations, and they all are mind-dependent, then the telephone is mind-dependent, dependent on a mind. And that's how Berkeley gets to the idea that everything's sensations, everything's mental, you know. Now, there are answers to this. So, at any rate, I wanted to at least get as far as I could and through Locke and Berkeley. You know, there's a separate thing on the Hume section, you know, recorded when I went over that PowerPoint. But concentrate on Descartes, Locke, and Berkeley. Most of the questions are on that. Again, it's the same deal, 25 questions. Make sure you get your Scantron form between now and Monday. We'll see you Monday. You know, if we have any bad weather, I don't think they're predicting any. Just check the college website or Blackboard. Thank you very much for coming. Have a good weekend. Okay. Yeah, come on in, folks. Come on in. We'll get started shortly. Thanks.